Some choices split a man's life clean in two. Abel Harkin never thought handing a canteen to a dying child would lead to an Apache woman pressing her hand to his cheek and saying something that would rattle him for the rest of his days. She didn't beg, didn't thank him, just made a choice like it was already written in the dirt. And the strangest part? She wasn't asking. She was declaring. For both of them. 3 days earlier, Abel had been riding the eastern fence line when he spotted the tracks. 2 sets, 1 adult, 1 child, dragging slow through the dust like someone was barely holding on. He'd taught himself not to look too hard at things like that. Curiosity got folks killed out here. But these prints led straight into the dry creek bed, dead land, and something in his gut twisted wrong. He found them under the dead limbs of a cottonwood tree. Both collapsed. The woman snapped awake the second his shadow crossed them, hand flashing to the knife on her belt so fast it made him flinch. She didn't strike, though, just held it steady, her eyes burning with the kind of exhaustion that sleep couldn't fix. The little girl beside her wasn't moving, lips split, chest rising too fast and shallow. Abel raised both hands slow. He knew better than to spook the desperate. The woman's knuckles whitened on the hilt, but neither of them moved. Then the child let out the faintest sound. A broken breath, not even a cry. Abel's voice was low. "Water," he said, nodding toward the canteen on his belt. "Just water." She didn't say a word, just watched. Abel knelt down real slow, uncapped the canteen, and held it out. Not to her, but to the girl. Trust had to start somewhere. He took the first step. She studied the canteen like it might hold poison. Then she looked at him, measuring. After a long pause, she snatched it and brought it to the child's lips. The girl drank like a starving colt, water spilling down her chin. The woman's shoulders dropped slightly, like she'd been carrying the whole desert and finally found a place to set it down. When the canteen was empty, she handed it back, never taking her eyes off him. "There's more at the house," Abel said, easing to his feet. "And shade. The real kind." Still silent, she gathered the girl into her arms and stood, barely. Abel could see now she was near spent herself. He didn't wait for permission, just turned toward home. If she followed, good. If not, that was hers to decide. But behind him he heard footsteps. Slow, staggering, but coming. The walk was longer than it should have been. She stopped often, shifting the child, legs buckling. Abel itched to help, but knew better. A blade drawn once wasn't something you forgot. So he kept ahead, moving slow, pretending not to see when she faltered. His house sat low in a narrow valley, pressed against rock that offered late-day shade. Nothing fancy, leaky roof, old wood, but it had walls and a well. That counted for a lot. She halted at the property line, staring at the place like it might explode. Eyes scanned every window, every shadow. "No one else," Abel said without turning. "Just me." Still, she didn't move, until the child whimpered again. That did it. She stepped forward, blade still within reach. Inside, it was cooler. Abel motioned to the bed, his only one. She laid the girl down, smoothing her hair. Fever was worse now. He saw it in her trembling, the heat in her skin. He fetched water, a rag, and the last pinch of salt he had saved for meat. She watched him closely as he mixed it, eyes sharp, like she was waiting for poison. He held out the cup. She didn't drink. She tasted. "Just salt water," he said. "For fever." She still didn't answer, just helped the child sip. and something in her face, hard as granite moments ago, finally cracked. Not much, but enough to show fear, the kind that came from losing too much already. Abel gave them space, lit the stove, kept his hands busy while the weight of silence filled the room. Then her voice broke through the quiet. Why? He turned slightly. Why what? Why help us? Her voice was like worn gravel. Your kind doesn't help mine. He didn't have a quick answer. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was the long years of silence eating at him. Maybe it was the look in the girl's face, the same look he'd seen the day his wife died, and he knew he'd failed both of them. Because she's a child, he said finally, and children shouldn't die for the things grown folks did wrong. She studied him for a long time. Then she said, soft as a breath, "My name's Nita." He nodded. "Abel Harkin." She looked back at the girl. "Her name is JC." And when Abel heard it, something shifted in him. He didn't know why, but it did. And he hadn't even begun to understand what that name, and that woman, would come to mean. "Why?" she asked, voice cracked and rough like desert stone. "Why help us?" Abel Harkin didn't turn from the fire. "What do you mean? You folks don't help people like us." He didn't have an answer that made much sense. Maybe it was the memory of watching someone die and being too late to stop it. Maybe it was the years he'd spent with no one left to care if he lived or didn't. Or maybe, just maybe, walking past them would have felt like a colder death than the one he already knew. "She's a child," he said at last, still stirring the flames. "And children shouldn't die for the things grown-ups got wrong." She didn't speak right away, but he could feel her watching, measuring, like she was trying to decide if he was a fool, a liar, or something else entirely. He didn't turn to meet her eyes. He let her sit with it. "My name's Nita," she said at last. He nodded slightly. "Abel." A long pause. "Her name's JC," she whispered, barely audible. Abel turned then, and for the first time since he found them, Nita wasn't looking at him with suspicion. She was looking at her daughter, with raw, shaking fear, the kind a man carries in his ribs long after it's passed. He recognized it. He'd seen it in his own face years ago, staring back at him in a cracked mirror after Lila died, and the child never came. "She'll pull through," he said, though he didn't know if it was true. Nita didn't answer. She just placed her hand against JC's burning forehead and murmured something under her breath in a language he didn't know. And Abel couldn't help but wonder, how desperate does a woman have to be to trust a stranger when every instinct screams not to? By nightfall, the fever still hadn't broken. If anything, it had worsened. Abel didn't sleep. He sat in the same crooked chair beside the bed, changing the rag on JC's forehead every few minutes, listening to her shallow breathing like it was the only sound that mattered in the world. Nita had finally collapsed near the window, overcome by exhaustion. Even then, her fingers still curled around the knife at her hip. JC's little body burned under the fever. Her skin was too hot to touch. Her breathing wet and fast, like every inhale hurt. Abel had seen this before, back when the winter chill swept through the settlements and took half the children. He remembered what happened when the fever didn't break by dawn. He kept pressing cold cloths to her neck, wrists, behind her knees. Anywhere blood flowed close. His rough hands, once calloused from fence wire and saddle straps, moved with surprising gentleness. It felt strange, this soft carefulness, but it came easy around her. Sometime before dawn, JC stirred. Her eyes cracked open, dazed and glassy. "Mama," she rasped, a sound so faint it barely hung in the air. "She's right here," Abel said gently, nodding toward Nita. She's resting now. You should too. JC's eyes drifted shut again, and something splintered deep in Abel's chest. He'd forgotten how small children could be, and how much space they could take up in a man's heart. At first light, Nita jolted awake, hand to her blade, eyes scanning fast until they landed on her daughter, then on Abel, still there, still tending, still fighting the fever like it was his own war to win. "You've been up all night," she said. It wasn't a question. "Fever's bad," he muttered, not looking up. "Can't let it get ahead of us." She crossed the room and laid her hand against JC's forehead. Her jaw clenched, and for a second, Abel thought she might cry, but she didn't. She just took the cloth from his hands and picked up where he left off. Steady. Silent. They worked like that for a while, passing the cloth, coaxing down sips of water, until Nita spoke again, her voice low. Her father died 8 months back. Hunting trip. Took an arrow in the leg. Infection killed him in 5 days. Abel nodded slowly, offering no words. He knew grief didn't need replies. "My father wanted me to marry his brother," Nita continued, wringing out the cloth. "Said it was tradition. Keeps the family together." She paused. Her tone turned flat. "But he was cruel. I saw how he treated his first wife. I said no." Abel understood before she even finished. "They gave me 3 days to change my mind," she said. "When I didn't, they cast me out. Said I wasn't one of them anymore. Said JC and I were on our own." She fell quiet again, staring down at her daughter. "I thought I could handle it. Thought I was strong enough. But the desert doesn't care how strong you are." Abel looked at her. Really looked, and saw what he'd missed before. The weight. The slow crumbling inside someone trying to carry too much for too long. "You did what you thought was right," he said. Nita's voice came back, bitter. "Right doesn't feed a child. Right doesn't break a fever." He had no argument for that. She was right, and there was nothing else to say. As the sun rose higher, the heat swelled inside the cabin. Still, the fever burned on. By midday, Nita's hands were trembling, fear and fatigue catching up to her. Abel stepped in again. "You need rest." "I can't. If I fall, who takes care of her?" Abel held her gaze. She hated that he was right, but she knew it. She sat down, slow and reluctant, but her eyes never left her daughter. An hour passed. Then, all at once, it broke. JC's skin cooled, her breaths slowed, and she slipped into real sleep, the kind that heals. Nita shot to her feet so fast the chair toppled behind her. She hovered, hands shaking, scared to touch her child, like it might undo whatever magic had saved her. "She's gonna be okay," Abel said. And this time, he believed it. And this time, Abel meant it. When Nita turned to face him, something in her eyes made him take a step back. It wasn't gratitude. It wasn't relief. It was something else entirely. Something that looked a lot like recognition. Like she was seeing him. Really seeing him for the first time. And realizing it changed everything. She crossed the room in 3 quiet strides and stopped right in front of him, close enough that he could still feel the heat from her skin. Her hand rose, just a little, and pressed against his cheek. Rough from work, warm from sitting vigil, steady, despite the faint tremble in her fingers. "I choose you to be the father," she said. Abel's first instinct was to back away. His second was to laugh. Maybe she'd lost her mind from too many sleepless nights. But he did neither. He just stood there, frozen, with her hand on his face, and those words hanging between them like a thundercloud that wouldn't break. "What?" he finally managed. She dropped her hand, but didn't break eye contact. "I choose you," she repeated, "to be the father. For JC. For me." She said it like it was the most natural thing in the world. Like folks did that all the time. Decide in a fever-sick cabin to bind their lives to a stranger. "I don't understand," Abel said. "I don't have anything. No tribe, no kin, no way to keep her safe." She looked toward JC, still curled in the bed, breathing easy now. "You saved her life," Nita said. "You stayed awake all night for a child you don't even know. That means something." "That doesn't make me a father," Abel replied. "It just means I'm not a monster." "You already are," Nita whispered. "You just don't know it yet." Abel turned from her, ran a hand through his hair. This was madness. He'd done what anyone ought to do, given water, warmth, a place to rest. It wasn't supposed to tie him to anything. "I can work," she said behind him. "I can cook, tend animals, know which plants heal and which ones kill. I can teach JC too. We won't be a burden." "That's not what I'm worried about." "Then what?" He turned to face her, the weight of old wounds creeping up his spine. "What happens when you change your mind? When you wake up and realize you don't want to be stuck out here with some broken farmer who couldn't even keep his wife alive?" The words came sharper than he meant, bitter with things he thought he'd buried long ago. But Nita didn't flinch. She met him steady. "What happens when you change your mind?" she asked. "When you decide you don't want the weight of someone else's child?" "That's different." "Why?" "Because you're the one taking the risk." "No," she said. "I'm risking more. If this falls apart, I have nowhere to go. You can walk away. I can't." And that somehow made it worse. Because saying yes would give him all the power, and Abel knew what unchecked power did to good men. He'd seen it in his father, after his mother died. Power used like a weapon, and no one to stop it. "I won't force you," Nita said softly. "If you want us gone once JC's strong enough, we'll go. I'll find another way." She paused. "But I'm asking you to consider it. Not out of pity. Not because I expect anything. But because last night I saw something I haven't seen in a long time. Kindness without a price. That's rare. And it matters." Abel looked to JC. Her tiny face was peaceful now, no longer twisted with pain. Then he looked at Nita. Still standing tall, still brave enough to ask for something no one else would have dared. He thought about the silence that filled his house for years. The emptiness that had become so normal, he'd stopped noticing it. The way time blurred into itself with nothing to mark it but changing seasons and dry wind. "If I say yes," he said slowly, "it's not because I'm taking in a stray, and you're not some servant. I'm not going to pretend this is something it's not." "What is it then?" she asked. "Survival," he said. "For all of us. I've been alone long enough to know that ain't living. And you need safety. Maybe we can give each other that, but there have to be rules." "I agree," Nita said. "You sleep in the bed with JC. I'll take the floor." "Agreed." "No one touches the other without permission." "Agreed." "And if either of us changes our mind, we talk about it. Honest. No running off in the night. No pretending everything's fine when it ain't." She extended her hand. Abel stared at it, then took it. Her grip was firm, calloused, unshaking. It felt like more than a handshake, like sealing something deeper than either of them had planned. "Then we have an arrangement," Nita said. And Abel Harkin wondered, quietly to himself, if he'd just made the best choice of his life, or the worst damn mistake he'd ever lived to regret. 3 days passed, and the house that had known nothing but wind and silence for so long started to breathe again. The sound of small feet in the morning, the hum of a woman's voice, and life, soft, steady life, coming back in from the dust. The soft hum of a woman's voice drifted through the cabin, singing something in a language Abel Harkin didn't understand. It mixed with the quiet scrape of a wooden spoon against a pot, the gentle rustle of worn cloth being stitched back to usefulness, and the slow, steady breathing of three people sharing a space without needing to fill every silence with words. JC bounced back faster than he'd expected. By the second day, she was sitting up, wide-eyed and curious, those dark lashes blinking at him in a way that pulled at a memory. His wife, Lila, before everything slipped away. By the third day, the little girl was standing. Shaky, stubborn, reaching for anything in sight just to prove she could. Nita never strayed far, always within reach. But Abel noticed. She wasn't just watching her daughter. She was watching him too. He'd taken to pointing at things in the evenings on the porch, teaching JC simple words. Bucket, cloud, porch. She echoed them back with a soft accent that made the plainest words sound like something more. Water, sky, home. That last one made Nita pause from grinding corn. She didn't say a word, but Abel saw the shift in her face. Whatever arrangement they'd stepped into had begun to feel, somehow, natural. Nita made meals out of scraps he'd long forgotten how to use. Dried meat, hard flour. Things that once kept him alive now tasted like real food. She worked without asking, mending the tears in his shirts he'd gotten used to, bringing order to the corners he'd let fall to dust and silence. When he told her she didn't need to do all that, she just looked at him with those unreadable eyes and said, "I told you I wouldn't be a burden." "That's not what I meant," he murmured. "Then what did you mean?" He didn't have an answer, not one he could say aloud. Truth was, he liked having her there, liked the quiet efficiency in her steps, the way her fingers moved with purpose, the way she hummed sometimes when she thought no one noticed, but saying so. That felt like crossing one of the lines they'd drawn. So he said nothing. Let her work. But some days, those lines blurred. Like when she reached past him for something on a shelf, and her arm brushed his. Or when they both gripped the same bucket handle and their hands touched, neither pulling away right away. Once, he caught her watching him while he repaired the fence. Their eyes met, and for a heartbeat, there was no arrangement, no rules, just a man and a woman standing too close for too long. He always looked away first, because admitting it would change everything. On the fourth morning, Abel was showing JC how to toss corn to the chickens when he heard his name. Nita's voice, low, sharp, enough to stiffen his spine. "Stay here, kiddo," he said to JC, then turned toward the house. Nita stood at the window, her body stiff, staring toward the eastern ridge. "Someone's coming," she said. Abel stepped beside her and followed her gaze. 3 riders, still a ways off, but coming straight for them. Even at this distance, he could tell they weren't settlers. They sat their horses different, moved different. And the way Nita's hand crept toward her blade said all he needed to know. "Your people?" he asked. She nodded, her voice cold now, drained of the warmth that had started blooming in her these past few days. "They've come for me." "What do they want?" Nita's jaw set tight. "To bring me back. To force the marriage." She didn't finish the thought. Didn't have to. Abel heard what she didn't say. If she refused again, they'd take JC. Use her to break Nita's will. "How long do we have?" 20 minutes, maybe less." He looked out to where JC was still playing in the dust, unaware. Boundaries didn't matter anymore. Neither did arrangements. If they weren't safe, none of it meant a damn thing. "Get JC inside," he said, "and stay away from the windows. Nita gripped his arm tight. Abel, you don't understand. These men won't back off because you ask them nice. They'll fight, if they have to. Then we'll handle it. He met her eyes. Whatever she saw in them made her nod and run for the girl. Abel moved to the far wall, lifted a dusty board, and pulled out the old rifle he hadn't touched in over a year. He loaded it carefully, checked the sights, then stepped to the doorway. The riders were close now, close enough he could make out their faces. The next hour would settle everything, one way or another. They stopped 50 paces from the porch, sitting their horses with the kind of stillness that only came from men who'd never been told no. The one in the center looked older, scarred arm, stone face. The two flanking him were younger, wide-shouldered, hardened by work and war alike. Abel stepped out, rifle loose but ready. He didn't raise it. Not yet. That would turn talk into blood too quick. "This here's private land," he called. "Speak your piece or move on." The older man dismounted, slow and deliberate. "We're here for the woman and the child," he said. "Nita. She belongs to our tribe." "People don't belong to anyone," Abel replied. "Your ways aren't mine. She made a choice. She chose wrong. She'll face the consequences." Abel felt the old heat stirring in his gut. This wasn't just about Nita anymore, and the men in front of him were about to find out just how much he was willing to lose to keep what he'd finally started to believe in. "Looks to me like she made her choice," Abel Harkin said, voice steady. "You just didn't like it. That's not the same as making the wrong one." The man's jaw tensed, but his voice stayed calm. "You don't understand what's at stake. This is about honor, family obligation. She has duties she's trying to run from. Her duty is to that little girl inside," Abel replied. "Everything else is dust. That child needs a father, one who won't treat her or her mama like a possession." "A proper father," the man corrected. "From her own people, not some stranger who brings in strays to cure his own loneliness." The words cut deeper than Abel wanted to admit, but he kept it off his face. "She has a father now," he said. "Me. And unless Nita tells me otherwise, neither of them are going anywhere." The man stared at him, measuring, calculating just how far he could push before this crossed a line they couldn't come back from. Then he shifted slightly and called toward the house. "Nita," he said, "come out. Let's speak like people." The door opened. Nita stepped through. She'd left JC inside. But the fear in her eyes was unmistakable, even as she held herself tall beside Abel, close enough their shoulders nearly touched. "Sani," she said. And Abel heard the weight of that name. This wasn't just any warrior. This was the one her father had once tried to bind her to. "You've stirred enough trouble," Sani said flatly. "Time to end it. Come home. Your daughter needs stability. She needs to be among her people." "She needs safety," Nita answered. "And I won't find that with you. I never laid a hand on you. Your first wife might have said different, if she were still alive." That hung in the air like smoke. One of the younger riders shifted in his saddle, and Abel knew this wasn't just accusation. They all knew the truth. Sani's eyes darkened. "You've no proof. You shame me with lies in front of this man." "I saw the bruises," Nita said, voice steady though her hands trembled. "I helped her cover them." Sani stepped forward. Abel lifted the rifle, just enough to show he wouldn't wait a second time. Sani stopped cold. His eyes flicked from Nita to Abel, weighing it. "So this is your choice?" he asked. "You'd rather stay with a white man? Let your child forget who she is?" "I'd rather she grow up safe," Nita said, "with someone who sees her as a daughter, not a bargaining chip." "The council won't accept this. Your father won't." "My father stopped being my father the day he tried to sell me to a man who beats women." That landed like a blow. Sani's hand twitched toward the knife at his side. The two younger men leaned forward, ready to move. Abel's finger slipped toward the trigger. The air turned glass-sharp. Time slowed. "You need to leave," Abel said, quiet but firm, "before this turns into something none of us can take back." Sani stared at him, working through the odds, 3 against 1. But the one had a rifle and a porch. They'd have to cross open ground, and there was no telling how it'd end. "This isn't over," Sani growled. "The council will have the final word. You'll answer for taking what wasn't yours." "She's not something to take," Abel said, "and I'll answer to no one for offering shelter to folks who needed it." Sani mounted his horse, his movements stiff with rage. Without another word, the 3 riders turned and headed back towards the hills. Abel didn't lower the rifle until they vanished behind the ridge. Even then, he kept it close. Nita stood beside him, shaking. "You should sit," he said gently, eyes still on the horizon. "I need to check on JC." "She's fine. She's safe inside. You, though, you look like you're about to fall over." She didn't argue. He guided her to the porch chair, and she sank into it like the weight of the last 10 minutes had finally landed. Abel leaned the rifle against the wall and crouched in front of her. That close, he saw the tracks of tears on her face, the ones she hadn't let fall until now. "You did good," he said, voice low, facing him like that. "I've doomed us," Nita whispered. "When the council decides, they'll send more, and they won't come to talk. Then we deal with it when it happens." "You don't understand," she said, meeting his eyes. "They won't just drag me back. They'll punish you for interfering, for claiming what they think belongs to them." She looked away, fear plain and unguarded. "I've put you in danger. I should go." "No." The word came out sharper than he meant, but he didn't walk it back. She blinked, startled, and that's when Abel Harkin realized, somewhere in these past few days, what had started as an arrangement, a way to survive, had shifted into something else. Something that had nothing to do with logic, and everything to do with her. "I meant what I said out there," Abel Harkin murmured. "You're not going anywhere, unless you choose to, and if your people don't like that, they can take it up with me." "Why?" Nita asked. Just one word, but it carried the weight of 1,000. "Why would you risk all this? For someone you barely know?" Abel stepped away from her, out to the edge of the porch. He looked out across the land he'd worked alone for years. It had once been a dream. Lately, it had started feeling more like a prison. "My wife," he said at last. "Lila. She died while I was gone." Nita didn't interrupt, just listened. "She went into labor early," he continued. "I was in town trading for winter supplies. By the time I made it back, it was too late. The baby never made it, and Lila, she bled out before I could even hold her hand." The words sat in his chest like stone. "After that, I shut everything down. I figured if I never got close again, I couldn't fail anyone like that again." "That's not failure," Nita said gently. "That's tragedy." Abel turned to her. "Maybe. But I still wake up every day wondering, if I'd stayed, would she be here now?" "And if you'd stayed," she said, "maybe you wouldn't have made it through that winter. You'd have had no food. Maybe you'd both be buried out back." She stepped up beside him. "You can't live your life preparing for every disaster. At some point, you stop living altogether." Abel looked at her. "Is that what you've been doing? Just surviving?" Nita nodded. "Ever since Taza died, every day was about keeping JC breathing. Nothing more." She paused. Her voice dropped, softer than the wind. "Until you. Until this." The space between them pulsed with something unspoken. Abel could feel the warmth of her skin, the faint scent of sage and wood smoke that clung to her hair. One word, one step, and they'd cross a line they couldn't uncross. But instead, Abel said, "Sani said something. Something's been bothering me. Like there's more going on than just a marriage refusal." Nita's expression shifted instantly. Guarded. Tight. "What is it?" he asked. "What aren't you telling me?" She turned away, arms crossed, jaw clenched. For a moment, he thought she might shut him out. Then she said it, so quietly he almost missed it. "Taza didn't die in a hunting accident." Abel stilled. "What?" "He was murdered," Nita said. The word dropped between them like a blade. "Tate, Sani's younger brother, did it. Made it look like an accident. Arrow to the leg, they said. But I know. I saw them argue. I heard Taza refuse to give up our land claim to the family." She hugged herself, staring out towards the hills. "I couldn't prove it. When I told the council, they called me grief-crazed, said I was imagining things." Abel's hands curled slowly at his sides. "That's why Sani wants you back," he said. "If you marry him, you can't testify against his brother." Nita nodded. "And my father, Ro. He supports it. Sani promised him a seat on the council, if I agree." "So this isn't about honor," Abel said. "It's about burying a murder." Nita's mouth tightened. It always was. Abel stared toward the eastern ridge, where the riders had vanished days before. This wasn't ending with talk or a council ruling. This was going to end in blood. And the only question was, whose? They came back 2 days later. Not 3 riders this time. 7. They didn't stop 50 paces out. They rode straight to the edge of the property. Sani dismounted like he owned the land under his boots. Abel had been ready. He'd spent 2 days reinforcing the cabin doors, securing the windows, checking every round of ammunition he had. Nita had wanted to flee, take JC and disappear into the desert. But Abel convinced her. Running only delayed the fight. And next time, there might be no high ground, no walls. This time Sani brought someone new. Older, gray-haired, proud. The way he carried himself told Abel this was no hired sword. Nita tensed. "My father," she whispered. Abel didn't raise the rifle, yet. "You're not welcome here," he called. "I said that last time." The old man's voice was steady, commanding. "I am Ro, elder of the Red Mesa. I've come to take my daughter home, to restore honor." "There's no dishonor in choosing safety over submission," Abel replied. "You don't understand our ways." "I understand your ways got a man murdered and a woman threatened for refusing to marry the killer's brother." The silence that followed was heavy. One of the riders shifted uneasily in the saddle. Sani's face twitched. But it was Nita who stepped forward before anyone else could speak. "I accuse Tate of murder," she said, "and I accuse Sani of protecting him, and I accuse my father of selling me to cover it all." Ro's face turned to stone. "You have no proof." "I have the truth," Nita said, and this time, not even the warriors could look her in the eye. "And witnesses," Nita said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. She lifted her hand and pointed to the 2 younger warriors who had ridden in with Sani the first time. "They were there. They saw Taza argue with your brother. They heard the threats, and they know that arrow wasn't loosed by accident." The 2 men exchanged a look, then dropped their eyes to the dirt. That silence said more than words ever could. "Speak," Ro commanded, his tone firm. "Is what she says true?" The younger one swallowed. "We saw the argument," he mumbled, "but we didn't see." "You saw enough," Nita snapped, stepping forward. You saw enough to know something was wrong, and you said nothing because you were afraid, just like everyone else. The air went still again. Abel Harkin watched Roe's face change, something shifting behind the elder's rigid features. Not quite guilt, not quite shame, but something that looked a lot like doubt. Even if there's truth to this, Roe said carefully, you're still bound by our laws. You don't get to walk away from your duty. Watch me, Nita replied. I already have. And the child, she belongs with her people. She belongs with her mother, Abel cut in, stepping up beside Nita, firm as the stone beneath his boots. And that's her, right there, whether you accept it or not. Sonny let out a low, bitter laugh. You really think claiming fatherhood changes anything? You think that makes you family? Abel held his ground. I think family isn't blood. It's who shows up, who stays, who chooses to care when walking away would be easier. He looked at Nita, then back at Sonny. And I choose them, every damn day. That's more than your brother did, more than you've done. Silence. No one moved. Then Roe turned to Sonny and said something sharp in their tongue, low and final. Sonny's jaw clenched, but he didn't argue. The elder turned one last time toward Nita, and this time something gentler glimmered in his eyes. You were always stubborn, he said quietly, just like your mother. Then he mounted his horse. One by one, the others followed. Even Sonny, though his final glance back was poison in his eyes. They disappeared over the ridge, and Nita collapsed. Abel caught her before she hit the ground. She clung to him like he was the last solid thing in a world trying to shatter her. Her tears soaked into his shirt, and he didn't let go. In that moment, Abel realized something he hadn't dared admit until now. They weren't strangers anymore. They were something else. Thank you, Nita whispered against his chest. You don't have to thank me for doing what's right. I wasn't thanking you for that, she said, pulling back just enough to meet his eyes, red but clear. I was thanking you for being the father I chose, the one JC deserves, the one I didn't know we needed. Until you were there. Behind them, the cabin door creaked open. JC peeked out. When she saw the men were gone, she bolted from the doorway, her little arms wrapping around both their legs. Abel leaned down, scooped her up like he'd been doing it all his life. She fit on his hip as natural as breathing. And maybe that's what family was. Not something you earned, not something born in blood, something you chose. Home? JC asked, her gaze bouncing between them. Nita smiled through the tears and reached out, brushing her fingers against Abel's face. That same quiet gesture, the one that had changed everything days ago. Yes, she said softly. Home. And Abel Harkin, who'd lived so long alone he'd nearly forgotten the meaning of that word, finally understood. Home wasn't a place. It was who you protected, and who chose to stay.